our planet Earth. A world of mystery and imagination, science and wonder that is constantly being gazed upon and unraveled by the finest minds humanity has to offer. Welcome to the UniV podcast, the show that presents a free-flowing conversation with those beings at the very center of the world of academia and research from all around the globe, with your host, Simon Holland.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm your host, Simon Holland, and today on the UniV podcast, we talk to Professor Alex Greenwood, who is the head of the Department of Wildlife Diseases at the Leibniz Institute for Zoo and Wildlife Research in Berlin, Germany. He also holds a faculty position in the Department of Veterinary Medicine at the Freie Universität Berlin. He studied biology at Cornell University before entering in the PhD program in human genetics at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, where he was awarded his PhD in 1996. Alex is known for his specialization in ancient DNA and RNA, and has to date contributed numerous papers in the field of evolutionary biology, wildlife biology, molecular evolution, and evolutionary genetics, amongst others. He recently appeared on the captivating documentary How to Clone a Woolly Mammoth, produced by the Smithsonian Channel, that investigated a world of cutting-edge science on the brink of a major genetic breakthrough. Professor Alex Greenwood, we welcome you to the show.
Hi, Simon.
Hey, thank you very much for speaking with us today on the podcast. On the way here, I saw a student wearing a Jurassic Park t-shirt. Should I take that as a good omen in this conversation?
Well, Pleistocene Park, maybe. Mammoths are more recent than T-Rexes and all the other animals in that, which actually was a misnamed movie anyway, since half the animals that were in that weren't from the Jurassic.
But yeah, I've been hearing that. Is that something that drives you nuts?
No, I mean, well, a little bit. The accuracy of science presentation in movies is usually pretty bad. I know some people get a lot more upset about it than me, including a mammologist who in 10,000 BC, they made the mammoths about 5 times larger than any mammoth that ever existed. And his beef with that as a mammologist is the animals are big enough and impressive without having to make them unrealistically large. So he didn't really understand what the motivation was there. With Jurassic Park, they just wanted all these different dinosaurs together, but T-Rex would not have seen most of the dinosaurs it was eating in those movies because it came much later.
Is it? Yeah, because it's a fine line between trying to trigger imagination, Hollywood style, and getting the facts right. The facts aren't boring. Exactly like you said about the mammalogists. Like the facts themselves aren't boring at all, are they?
No, I think that's what frustrates most scientists is that the facts aren't boring. So it doesn't always make sense to then completely alter them and turn it into pure fantasy. For that, why not then just have dragons and unicorns and all the other stuff that you would have in a Tolkien film, which is fun to watch too, but then you don't have to try to, part of the time, adhere to any kind of fact. You just make a science fiction movie.
Now, some parts of that film kind of, because I guess the good lie, they say, impinges on the truth and, steals bits of the truth. What part of that film is legit, and how's that similar to what you guys are trying to do there?
I would say pretty much none of it is legitimate.
Oh, okay then.
On the grounds that the molecules, DNA, that you would need has never been retrieved or confirmed or retrieved from samples that old. So there's never been confirmable DNA retrieved from amber. There's definitely been none retrieved from fossil dinosaurs. The problem with dinosaur fossils is they aren't actually bones of a dinosaur. They're mineral imprints of a bone of a dinosaur that died tens of millions of years ago. So there is no DNA there. There's no bone there. So you're not going to get dinosaur DNA out of it. But just for the sake of argument, let's say there is a bone out there somewhere that does have DNA in it. Up till now, the ability to clone wild animals, even that we know or have in our own hands right now, has been really miserable.
Yeah.
The success is very, very low. And that's starting with eggs and sperm and full genomes. And anything you get from a dinosaur would be thousands of times poorer quality with no reference either. So, the idea of cloning a mammoth is you use an elephant as the mother for gestation, but what would you gestate where would the eggs develop in a dinosaur? So it's a nice fantasy idea, and the amber idea was great as a science fiction tool, but it's not really based on anything from what we're dealing with in current facts. And that's why I think Jurassic Park is less what people are focused on, and it's more people talking about bringing back more recently extinct animals like mammoths or the Tasmanian tiger, and animals where there's more available biomolecules. So you can get mammoth DNA, you can get Tasmanian tiger DNA relatively easily. So I think that's where more of the focus is.
And do you think that it's maybe a misguided appropriation of this technology to try and bring back these ancient species versus conserving what we already have?
I wouldn't call it misappropriation, but I think that's right. I mean, if you take rhinos and modern elephants, they're declining right now because there's a market for their tissues. And so you've got poachers going out and slaughtering them. So, and it's been amazingly unsuccessful, the efforts in stopping this. So we have all these major species declines of what we have. For me, what's the cloning or bringing back species going to achieve? If you can't save the ones that are here now with international efforts, what's going to be the fate of animals you bring back? Which don't even have an environment to bring them back to. So, bringing a woolly mammoth back as a circus freak is not, I wouldn't list that as a conservation effort. It's more of because we could do it type of effort. So in that regard, I'm not really in favor of it. I think as a pure scientific effort, trying to figure out how to piece together old genomes and bring back even cells from an extinct animal would be interesting. You could learn a lot about them in that regard. But I don't really look at it as a true conservation effort, which is how it's very often sold. I'm
not really in the business of quoting Hollywood movies in science conversations, but we saw a situation in that movie War of the Worlds where the aliens came into the world and then ended up dying of the flu, because of the flu. If you brought something back from the past, it would really struggle in this new environment, wouldn't it? And part of the work that you do is on viral properties of these ancient species.
Yeah, I mean, one problem is if you bring them back, people usually clone of them from different sources. There won't be very much genetic variation, and who knows what they're susceptible to. So mammoths went extinct about 3,000 years ago. They were in the mainland. It was 10,000 years ago, but on some of the islands like Wrangel Island and some islands in Alaska, there were still mammoths around, but the pathogen content of the environments has changed pretty drastically in the meantime. So it's not really clear they would survive. I doubt they would be carrying anything themselves because the whole cloning process is coming from single cells, and there shouldn't really be anything of the ancient pathogens left in them. But yeah, they could be very susceptible in the same way that, which isn't actually unique to this sort of science fiction idea. If you have captive breeding colonies of animals that are rare or extinct in nature, and you want to release those animals back into the wild, you also face sometimes cases where your breeding colony may not have what it takes to survive in the wild anymore. And there's always the risk that you send your animals out and then they all get infected by other animals in the environment, and it's unsuccessful.
Now, you've been doing a bit of work with retroviruses, really ancient retroviruses, and do you think that's a part of the extinction process? I mean, there's a lot of theories between being hunted. They only existed, like you said, 10,000 years ago on the mainland. But what about the viral side of things as a sort of a theory and understanding of why they died out?
Well, I'm doubtful that I can imagine cases where retroviruses could cause an extinction in an animal that's already suffering. So we're doing a lot with koala retroviruses and looking at how an invading retrovirus is shaping koala biology. Whether it causes extinction there's some question about that. There's probably other things that are causing more problems for koalas than retroviruses. But the idea of pathogens in general, whether it's viral, bacterial, or parasite, we are exploring, particularly with mammoths and musk oxen, which lived in the same area, but unlike mammoths survived. We are exploring the idea that at the time when we transitioned from the Pleistocene to what's now the Holocene, there were also major environmental changes. And these major environmental changes included retraction of the ice sheets that were covering much of the world at the time. And what this could allow is populations that have been separated for long periods of time to suddenly become reconnected, including reservoirs of viral diseases and bacterial diseases that would now be able to cross into territories where they wouldn't have been before. And what we think might have happened is you would have had introduction of these diseases into new populations, which would have had severe consequences for particularly the bigger animals, which have slow reproductive rates. And you can think of it as like when the conquistadors went to Central and South America, they actually, through warfare, killed less people than they did through disease. It's sort of like the typhoid Mary principle. You're in a population that's been exposed to a lot of disease and adapted to them for a long time, and you show up somewhere that's been very isolated, you can kill everybody with diseases that we just think of as common childhood nuisances, but which have unbelievably bad consequences for a population that's never been exposed to them. And it's actually a concept that Ross McPhee of the American Museum of Natural History coined, called hyperdisease.
When you're looking at the scale of these kind of activities for extinction, what do you learn about the Earth and its ability to sort of, I guess, level the playing field if things get out of whack?
For obvious reasons, there's a negative connotation of extinction, but extinction is also part of life, and way more things have gone extinct than have actually evolved into new things. So extinction is actually the more common event than creation of new lineages, species, or whatnot. And what I think in extinction, when people think about extinction, we really have to make a distinction between natural extinction. So there are just species there that don't compete as well, or lineages or groups that don't compete as well in a given environment than others. And so one will become more prevalent and the other may just disappear. And this happens all the time. It happens in bacteria, it happens in viruses, it happens in birds, mammals, and whatever. And it's been happening ever since there were any of these organisms, which is a distinct kind of extinction than the one that most people who are thinking about conservation or worrying about human impacts on the world are thinking about, which are those that we're causing. So it's different than, so there were many species of koalas before, not just the ones you're familiar with, and all but one are extinct. And it's probably not because of people. So the koalas we have today are the lucky winners of this evolutionary lottery. But it's different than, say, what's happening now, where building highways or settlements in areas where koalas would live remove their ability to survive, because it's not that they're failing to compete as koalas, they're just being driven out by preventable human impacts. And I think that has to be distinguished, because in the one case, you want to stop poachers from killing rhinos, because that's not really a natural event. That's an economically driven, pretty barbarous market that's developed. It's different than if one rhino species was pushing out another one because it just had a higher reproductive rate, was more resistant to diseases, because then you're interfering in a natural process. So if you think, going back to the aliens, if the aliens would have time machines and go back and make sure that no dinosaurs went extinct, then we wouldn't be here either.
Yep.
Because you'd have some artificial force preventing something that in principle shouldn't be able to compete and knocking out things that would have been better suited to their environment in the natural process. So I think it's a pretty big distinction that very often gets lost.
Do you think now adaptation obviously happens over a long period of time? Do you think we're going to see any species that physically and behaviorally adapt to humanity? If we look at one case in, say, the domestic dog, I guess they started off as a wolf and then they decided that they could get an easier feed hanging out with us.
We're already seeing it. There are certain species of mountain goats, and that because trophy hunters want, these big presentable horns, there's already been a strong selection to have small horns. So the average size of the male's horns, which would usually be there to compete for mates, is shrinking because the risk of getting killed and being removed from the population having the bigger horns is so detrimental that it's better to lose a little bit of your ability to attract a mate than just be removed from the population completely. So you have things like that. You have things like elephants change their behavior based on where humans are. I mean, you're starting to see, even in very short periods of time, adaptation to things we're doing where they can. I mean, the problem is that usually these adaptations take a long time to develop. And so you probably, the pressure you put on things, like, if you pour mercury into a river and the animals don't have time to adapt to that, it's just too much of a acute shock into the environment that they just don't have time. But if it's a milder thing like hunting pressure, where not every single individual who could be hunted will be, it gives them enough time and it can go pretty quickly. They can start to adapt to these human pressures. And you'll see things like that. And even historically, without human pressure, animals that end up on islands if they're large, tend to shrink. So you had these pygmy elephants in Cyprus and places like that, which were the size of ponies, basically. So even in the short term, animals can adapt. It's just that a lot of things that we do outstrip their ability to adapt. This is
a real opinion question here, but when you look at humanity and the modern trends, and then you look at us as like the past beast of the forest kind of style, do you look at those the trends that are happening and feel like we're going backwards as a species that used to roam around? Or how do you feel about that personally?
How do you mean backwards?
Like, I mean, we seem to be, I think if you took like a modern human and put it in the forest, it probably wouldn't fare so well. I mean, I did just see The Revenant and that guy didn't go so well, but I feel like a modern human would probably be worse. It'd be pretty quick to get it gobbled up or something.
Well, I think the issue is we're at risk of going backwards very quickly because a lot of the things that we do are not sustainable. So the kind of energy consumption, water scarcity, which affects about 4 billion people, resource scarcity means that some of the advances we've made in ways that we live based on those advancements may come crashing to a halt. And also the way we use and abuse biodiversity, basically making it less and less diverse, could have unforeseen consequences. If there's something out there we desperately need and we kill it off, it's not going to be something we can replace. You also just even thinking about climate change, regardless of whether you're someone who believes it's human-caused or not, climate change is happening, and it could also lead to either diminishing or end of the way we live. And the idea that just we'll figure it out when we get there because scientists will manage is not really a very good bet. And so there are a lot of things that people, or humans as a species, have placed bets on non-renewable resources that may have huge consequences in the near future. So in that regard, I don't say we're going backwards, but we could. And quickly. We can end up throwing ourselves back into the Bronze Age if you imagine suddenly we couldn't produce electricity anymore or there was no more fuel. I think you would see that society would change drastically and very quickly.
I was watching on the Black Friday sales where they have $200 off TVs and things like that. And yeah, we saw like humans basically trampling each other. So if they go back into the place where like exactly like you said, water scarcity or food scarcity, I mean, it's going to be an interesting time. And I guess that's really going to be survival of the fittest.
I think water scarcity is going to be the first major problem because it already is around 4 billion people are already affected by this. So you're looking at almost half the planet dealing with severe water scarcity. And it will probably become much more of a top agenda issue as soon as it gets more noticeable in the developed world, which it's already started a little bit. There were these immense water shortages in California recently where people weren't allowed to water their lawns and do things that they were used to doing. And you immediately can see how problematic that becomes. And that's just the beginning of these types of problems. And of course, since everything else depends on water, it'll have effects throughout the entire world ecosystem.
Now, do you see relationships between creatures? Is that one of the things that you look at, relationships between creatures that currently exist and sort of their cousins, their ancient cousins? And do you draw, I saw you had a recent paper, Evolutionary Relationships Among Extinct and Extinct Sloths.
Right.
So is that part of the compare contrast? What take us through that process?
Well, the issue with a lot of the ancient DNA stuff we've done or is being done right now is very often you'll have a bone or you might even have a complete skeleton and you'll look at all the morphological features and not really be able to come to a conclusion about what the animal actually was. You might be able to say this was some kind of ancient sloth, but what kind? Like, is it like a two-toed sloth or a three-toed sloth or some other type of extinct sloth? And when there was no DNA analysis, then you just kind of argued it based on morphology, but you were stuck. And then what we started to see when we looked at DNA is that a lot of things we had assumed about relationships of different species were not true. Not always, but sometimes pretty spectacularly. Even with humans, we're now finding all these different species of humans that coexisted with us even 10, 20,000 years ago. Not just Neanderthals, but all these other human species. And so we try to get DNA and look at these types of relationships. So in the case of the sloths, for example, there were some morphological studies that would have suggested that the small tree sloths that exist today should be closely affiliated because they're morphologically similar. They have the same body size or relatively similar body size. But then it turns out the two-toed sloths you would find in places like Costa Rica are actually much more like these absolutely enormous ground sloths, mylodons that lived 10,000 years ago in places like Chile. And the three-toed sloths are more like these bear-like size sloths that lived in Central America and the southwest of the United States. So you kind of throw that off. And then we also looked at how viruses that were in them were evolving. And we can see that it doesn't really follow what the sloths were doing. It's more like waves of infection that we couldn't see just looking at a bone, but we can start to trace back in time by looking at ancient DNA.
I feel like being a large ground-dwelling sloth is probably not going to be the best recipe for success.
Yeah, these things were gigantic. They were bigger than elephants. There are two groups that had there was Megatherium and Mylodon were these just colossal sloths, and then the others were more bear-like size. Still pretty big when you consider that a living sloth is not very big.
And super friendly. They've evolved friendliness. I don't know. What got you into this? I mean, you look at all these marvelous creatures and you deal with some of the kind of the coolest, the classical coolest like the mammoths, etc. What got you into how'd you fall into this sort of line of work?
A lot of it just random, following things around. But I originally started from a more medical angle and also from looking at viruses. But since I'd worked on mammoths years ago as a postdoc, I was interested in the idea that from things we were seeing that the things we observe today may be very recent or not very reflective of the recent past. And for me, that extends to diseases. And so I started getting very interested in trying to merge disease research with ancient DNA to see if things that we're concerned about now are old, recent, young, have always been there, have made some big change. Sort of the kind of things that I can't really do if I just look at what's out there right now.
Mm-hmm.
So I spend most of my time looking at what's out there right now, because for most things we don't know. But for specific things where we have a pretty good idea of what's going on today, like koalas, it's very interesting to go back in time and see what was happening in koalas in the recent history, and the project we're doing now looking at 10,000-year-old koalas to see what their infection history looked like much longer ago.
Yeah, I think it's by the sound. Well, obviously I'm located in Australia, so it sounds like you need to do a trip down here because we've got lots of stuff that you want to work on.
I was there last year. I have students. I have an Australian student, and I have people bouncing back and forth in Australia and Germany.
Yeah, I guess because it's such a unique environment down here, and so separate for a long time that we sort of developed some interesting creatures, lots of which are deadly, but it's mostly a nice place.
Well, the koala's not so deadly, so I can focus on that.
I heard they can be bad-tempered.
They do bite, but they don't poison you.
No, that's the one evolutionary trait that's probably my least favorite, the poisoning ability.
Well, the crocodiles are also not so biting isn't so great either.
That's true.
But yeah, the poison animal prevalence in Australia is quite amazing.
Was that something you worried about coming down? I mean, you know the facts. You know how everything got here. When you step into a place like that, do you look at it a little differently from the usual tourist?
I probably wouldn't want to run around barefoot in shorts in places where there's like funnel spiders and other things running, or where the snakes are. But we have projects in Africa, and those are also extremely dangerous because of the carnivores. And there's usually, except maybe for New Zealand, there's risks associated with most places. Because in New Zealand, there's pretty much nothing poisonous and nothing that bites.
Yeah.
So
just dodgy people. No, I'm just joking. We say that with affection as neighbours.
But it's exactly the opposite of Australia in terms of its animal.
If people want to find out more about your work, where's the best place to catch you? Are you active on social media? Is there?
There's ResearchGate. I'm not active in social media. My institute is ResearchGate. I usually post papers as they come out, and there are some forums there for discussion, or through our press releases and our press office here. But ResearchGate's probably the best place because that's where you get to the papers and good stuff. And because directly contacting me is not always so easy because I'm usually somewhere else.
Well, we hope you wish you all the best on your travels. And Professor Alex Greenwood, thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you.
Take care.
Nice talking to you.
And that's about all we have time for this, the second show of the Univ podcast. We hope to continue to bring you more interesting people to talk to in a variety of fields. We shall see you next time for the next installment of the Univ podcast.
Well, that's all we have time for this week. Thank you for listening to the Univ podcast. To follow our series, please subscribe to our channel via iTunes, Beyond Pod, or the equivalent service. And if you particularly enjoyed the show, please don't forget to rate. For further information, news, videos, and articles, head to univ.com.au.